Welcome to Was Justice Served, the podcast where we journey back in time to some of the past's most cryptic criminal cases, brought to you by Findmypast. In each episode, our experts take a look at the evidence found in our historical newspapers and records and try to unpick what really happened. We'll be looking at the gory, the heartbreaking, and the shocking cases that gripped the nation. Join us as we uncover some of history's most scandalous crimes, follow the twists and turns of the trial, and ask the ultimate question, was justice served? But don't just take our word for it, analyze the evidence for yourself. For each episode, you can access the case files, a complete collection of the historical newspapers we've talked about, all online at findmypast.co.uk/was justice served. Before we get started, this is just a note to say that this is a crime podcast, so it will contain graphic descriptions and scenes that some listeners may find upsetting. Welcome to the fourth episode in our series. I'm Jen Baldwin, professional genealogist and research specialist at Findmypast.
And I'm David Wilson, Emeritus Professor of Criminology. I write books and I also present TV programs and podcasts with Jen.
Today's episode, David, is really quite interesting, examining a really mysterious case from Southend. But I have to thank a member of our community for this first. This case was sent to us by Tom Fitton, who is a passionate family historian and a member of the Findmypast Facebook community. And he is the one who originally made these connections and sent us this story for us to delve into today.
Well, thank you, Tom. That's really kind of you. Let's see what we make of it.
Yeah, let's see what Tom sent us.
Saturday the 2nd of June, 1906. In the coastal Essex town of Southend-on-Sea, a tragedy has just been discovered. Julia Wood is awoken at 6:45 a.m. by her neighbour, 43-year-old Army veteran Robert Pointer. "For God's sake, come. I've just found Carrie dead." Carrie is Julia's sister-in-law, the sister of her husband, John. Robert is Carrie's partner. The pair have lived together with Carrie's mother for the past couple of years. Julia hurries next door barefoot. She runs up the narrow wooden stairs and into the bedroom, where she finds 50-year-old Carrie laid out on the floor in her nightgown, a bundle of clothes beneath her head. She is cold to the touch, but Julia can see no clear cause of death. She wakes Carrie's mother, Mrs. Wood, who's asleep in the bedroom downstairs. Upon seeing her daughter's body, Mrs. Wood starts screaming at Robert in distress. "You have killed my poor girl." Shocked, Robert adamantly denies having any hand in Carrie's death. Amidst the shouting, Julia fetches another neighbour. They fetch a local policeman and a doctor. By 8 a.m., local physician Dr. Bluck has arrived at the home on Beach Road. Upon inspecting Carrie, the doctor discovers a bruise on her abdomen. He determines that the bruise is recent. Experience tells him that Carrie has been dead for at least 6 hours, most likely between 8 and 10 hours, putting her time of death at around midnight. A post-mortem of Carrie's body reveals a fractured rib, a blood clot, and a ruptured spleen. Her cause of death is determined to be a hemorrhage from the ruptured spleen, caused by an injury with considerable force. An unlucky fall could have caused such an injury, but so could the sharp toe of a boot.
The sharp toe of a boot. What are your first impressions on this one, David?
Two things struck me. The first is a criminological reality, which I don't think is really appreciated, which is if you're a man or a woman, whether we're talking about 1906 or 2006, whether you're a man or a woman, you're more likely to be murdered. If this is indeed a murder, you're more likely to be murdered in your home than in an outdoor public space like an unlit alleyway or an indoor public space like a pub or a nightclub. But it was just when I was listening to the story, it made me remember that, there are a number of women who get murdered by being pushed down the stairs, and then their husbands or partners or boyfriends will try to stage the crime scene to make it look as if it's been a terrible accident. And that's what we've got here. And then the other thing, again, without wishing to jump straight to murder, Jen, is that 2 women a week in England and Wales are murdered by their partners or ex-partners. So this would be very common in terms of murder if this is indeed the crime of murder rather than an accident.
Right. Very sobering statistic, unfortunately, but appropriate in this sense. There are a couple of details that we really need to focus on. One is that situation of the relationship itself. But there's also a couple of questions that I have as well. He's an Army veteran. I want to know a little bit more about that, especially in this time frame, right? This is the Victorian era and entering into the Edwardian period, when we are really a culture and a society of masculinity, and gender roles are incredibly important. That piece about him being in the Army and being a veteran, that's pretty crucial here, I think, and something I want to delve into.
Okay, and again, the final piece of current relevance in terms of this historical story to the situation we find ourselves in today is that veterans of the forces still make up a significant proportion, a small but significant proportion of the prison population, which isn't meant to stereotype people who join the forces, but we still to this day have a large number of ex-forces personnel who will be serving prison sentences.
And of course, what we know today as PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, was certainly not known or diagnosed or a condition in this period. So depending on when and where he served, there may be some mental health implications here as well. Carrie is found dead in her home, and it takes 3 days for Robert to be charged with willful murder.
Oh, so there is going to be a murder charge brought.
There is going to be a murder charge.
And that's interesting, isn't it? Because even from what we have discovered already, that Carrie's mother claims that she shouted, "You've killed my poor girl." So right from the start, Carrie's mother thinks that her partner, Robert, has indeed committed.
Yeah, she's pointing fingers right away. So let's go into the main players, shall we?
Yes, please.
Let's start with Carrie. Her full name is Carolyn Lewin. I think I'm pronouncing that right. She's 50 years old, so she's born in 1856, and of course she dies as a result of this incident, 2nd of June, 1906. She is already a widow, so she's been married previously. She was cohabitating with Robert, and they did that for several years, but they never actually got married.
Now, why, again, this is something that's cropped up previously in the podcast, but why not get married? Why cohabit, especially at a time when respectability is all?
Is key, right? There's a number of reasons, and we probably will never know Carrie's exact reason for that decision. It's possible that they just weren't ready to make the commitment. It's possible that she wanted to hold on to some of that independence of being a widow, because that did give you a more inclusive legal status as a woman. You had a little bit more control of your life, your finances, you could own property, those kinds of things. So we're getting into a period where women are starting to develop a little bit more freedom, a little bit more ability to kind of maneuver around society on their own without that strong dependence on a male figure. Now, not to say that they were free by any means. They still had a lot they could not do. But she may have tasted a little bit of that and just decided to leave it alone.
And of course, we're still dealing at a period in time where there's coverture, that if
Absolutely.
if the woman marries, her legal personality is subsumed into the legal personality of her husband. That husband takes control over all of her possessions, all of her money, etc., etc.
Yeah, absolutely. So once you make that legal connection to another person, everything changes for you in terms of your status as a woman, especially as a widow. So that's my guess with Carrie. But we also will get into some trouble in this relationship.
So you've described Carrie as a widow. So she's been married before?
She has been married before. Her first husband was Henry Lewin. He was a carpenter. He dies of pneumonia in 1902, so 4 years before she passes away as a result of this violent act. The couple was married in Southend in 1875. They have one daughter, Elizabeth, who lives in Prittlewell. She's 29 at the time of her mother's death, no longer lives at home.
Okay, so there is already a family. Carrie, by this stage, has created for herself a life, and then she meets with Robert Poynter, who is going to be charged with her murder. What do we know about Robert Poynter at this stage?
So Robert Poynter is born in 1863. He's 43 at the time of this crime. He's born in Malden. He's working as a laborer in 1906, obviously very common occupation.
Sure.
But by this period, being a laborer is a little bit more difficult than it has been in the past. He's a British Army veteran. He joined the Army in 1883 at the age of 19. He serves in the Royal Artillery for 12 years, but he actually serves with the Home Guard militia. So he's stationed in the UK. He never actually goes abroad anywhere. He doesn't see any kind of active military
service
engagement.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when you were mentioning earlier PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, there's no evidence that he goes into combat,
right.
that he
Exactly
faces
right.
Bullets flying or whatever. That's not really, he didn't fight in the Boer Wars.
Right. That's exactly right. Yeah. He's discharged in 1895 and just had a good career in the Army, but not necessarily a violent one.
And there does seem to be a very complex family picture going on in terms of Carrie and Robert's familial situation, domestic arrangements. Can you give me a little more information about that? Was Carrie's mother living with Robert and Carrie?
Yeah, and it's interesting because obviously Carrie's mother is right there on the scene, right? And she's immediately there seeing Carrie's body. Her name is Phoebe Wood. She is also a widow. She's 82 at the time of the crime. So she's born in 1824, obviously not working, just at home.
Are there any other family members I should be aware of that the listeners should take note of?
Yeah, there's a couple more people here. So we need to talk about John and Julia Wood. This is Carrie's brother and sister-in-law. They live just 2 doors down. John is 9 years older than his sister Carrie. So certainly almost a fatherly figure, perhaps, because of the age difference. It's kind of a guess on my part, to be really honest, but it feels like 9 years is a pretty significant chunk of time to have kind of that relationship.
And do we know what John did? What work did he do?
Yeah, actually. So he was in the Army himself as well. He joined up at the age of 17, and he becomes a private in the 59th Foot Infantry. But he also then, after leaving the Army, he works as a waterman. So he transfers people across the water, kind of like a boat taxi.
But therefore, because of that, the fact that he had also been a soldier, there must be some sense in which he understands Robert. He
I would have to think there's some commonality there, right? There's common ground for them to kind of build a relationship with, potentially. But we also know that the women are quite close as well. They were seen around in public kind of running errands together. So it feels like the two women are truly acting as sisters in a very sister relationship.
This seems to be quite a complex, close-knit family unit that's being described here, doesn't it?
But it doesn't seem like Robert is really kind of in that circle. It almost feels like he's a little bit distant from the rest of the family.
Do you know what's interesting already is that I'm now seeing that we're going to have two competing narratives, aren't we? We're going to have the narrative of the family who survive, who are going to conjure up a picture of domestic abuse, coercive control, of Robert as a ne'er-do-well from his army days, his army experiences. But we've also got Robert, and Robert's going to tell us one particular narrative, and who's missing from the narrative is, of course, Carrie herself. She can't speak. She can't tell us what's actually been happening.
And she can't then, of course, to either defend her relationship or not defend it. There appears to be kind of a public consensus and a public sympathy for Carrie when this story comes out. And the newspapers describe Robert as a short, stiff man with, and I quote, the appearance of an old soldier. He is said to have remained calm during the inquest and maintained his innocence throughout the case.
The other thing that strikes me already is that there is no witness itself. There is no witness to the actual event that's going to lead to what happens to Carrie, her injuries. There's no weapon to be uncovered. But we've presumably got Dr. Bluck. Is that how I pronounce his name?
I believe so, yeah.
Dr. Bluck. We've got Dr. Bluck's evidence, his testimony about the injuries that she receives. And that, I suppose, is the one piece of forensic evidence that we can point to. Could these injuries have happened prior to the night in which Carrie's going to die, and she dies subsequently of those injuries? These injuries, in other words, were caused several days before, or could they only have been caused on the night in which she dies?
Yeah, it gets really interesting in the testimony. Even Robert himself actually testifies that Carrie had complained to him that she'd fallen a few days before.
So Robert's defense is he's constructing a narrative that Carrie's had a tragic accident. She's fallen against some sort of sharp corner in the bedroom. And of course, Carrie's not there to disagree. She's not there to give her side of the story. And how does that get treated by the evidence that Dr. Bluck is able to provide?
Robert definitely sets himself up as, this is simply an accident. She fell down the stairs. She hit something sharp. And I think actually one of the pieces for me that comes out of this case that maybe is even a little bit more in your bailiwick is they actually...
Bailiwick?
I said bailiwick. They take photographs of the bedroom.
Oh, right.
This is the first time in our conversations, David, that something like this has come up as evidence presented at trial. We haven't seen this yet so far in our discussions. But they reveal in these photographs that there are no sharp corners consistent with Carrie's injuries, that she could have fallen on and injured herself so much that she actually ends up dying. So if she did have a fall a few days before, as Robert testifies, it must have been on the stairs or in the kitchen. There's a very limited number of places in which something like that could have been caused in the home, but it doesn't seem to have happened the night that she died.
So we're still looking for the sharp instrument that is going to cause the injury that Dr. Bluck describes, and that is either consistent with a sharp object that she's going to fall against, or indeed the boot. So we've got evidence that Dr. Bluck presents at court, and he says the injuries of that kind could only have been caused at the moment, within the day in which she died. In other words, any claim that somehow Carrie had fallen down several days previously and is going to die of her injuries several days later doesn't seem to him to hold true. Dr. Bluck says the spleen was ruptured, there was a clot of blood immediately beneath the fractured rib, and he attributes death to rupture to the spleen caused by some injury. He says that this is a ruptured spleen. Now, a ruptured spleen is not going to be, it's not going to be, it's going to have a great deal of pain attached to it. This is not, not an injury that one would wish on anybody at all. And those injuries, if your spleen are ruptured, would cause death relatively quickly. I don't think that bodes well, though, really, for Robert, does it? I mean, obviously, those injuries kill Carrie, but for Robert, that destroys his argument that this is an accidental death. And that points to the nature of their relationship. What do we know about that relationship in the months leading up to Carrie's murder?
We have another witness immediately in the household. So Phoebe, the mother, is also there. So we have these two women, Phoebe and Julia, who really have very strong relationships with Carrie, the victim. And they both speak to that issue of domestic violence during the testimony. Carrie's sister-in-law testifies that she had heard arguments between the two, that Carrie had confided in her when Robert threatened her. And Julia actually continues in a very, very vehement statement during the trial. She says that Carrie confided in her that Robert treated her badly and had threatened to rip her throat out.
Oh my gosh, this isn't... So to threaten to rip someone's throat out.
She is quoted to say that Carrie told her, Robert's not safe to live with. And this happened just a month before her death. Carrie at that point asked Julia to call the police, but her husband, Carrie's brother John, stepped in and would not let Julia interfere.
Oh, no, now here we're getting this is very, very interesting indeed, isn't it? Quite apart from the fact it's tragic for Carrie, who's going to lose her life, because the original picture was of a family close by,
absolutely,
all being connected to one another, looking out for one another. But why this reluctance to call the police if there is this level of domestic abuse ongoing within the household?
Yeah, you have to remember, too, that sense of masculinity and pride in the home that we've been discussing so much, David. It really comes out in that little bit of a man's home is his castle. And as another man, I'm not going to invade that castle. What happens between Robert and Carrie is between Robert and Carrie. And it's not Julia's place or John's place to step in and say, hey, Robert, you need to clean up your act. That's not what society's doing in this period.
When the curtains get drawn, who knows what happens behind those curtains?
Yeah, exactly right.
And so there's a reluctance even in 1906 to be seen to be interfering in terms of the domestic sphere between what happens between man and wife. You know, one of the things I often find today is that when you deal with a murder case that involves partners, husband, wife, people living, cohabiting together, often the reality of their life is very different to the social media that they present about their lives.
Absolutely.
You know, they present this picture perfect domestic sphere, whereas in fact the reality is very different indeed. But what strikes me about this case is that Carrie's actually sharing with people, this isn't going well, but people still seem unable to make a change for them.
Yeah.
If the police had been called, what would the police have done in those circumstances at that time? To this day, women will talk about the fact that they were in a domestically abusive relationship and they reported it to the police, and the police turned a blind eye to what went on. You know, if they had called 1906, if they had found a way of alerting the police to what was happening in their relationship, would there have been any intervention within their lives?
I'm going to turn that question back to you, David.
Well, I'm going to tell you that there wouldn't have been any intervention in their lives. It would be my sense of what happens from this period of time. You know, there does seem to be a set of circumstances here in which we're describing powerlessness. We're describing a lack of agency. Carrie cannot make her life different, because anytime she does try to make her life different, people say, no, you've just got to grin and bear it. You've just got to get on with the circumstances that you find yourself in. And, you know, one's heart goes out for her. We're
starting to at least build to the idea that this relationship is not nearly what it seems. Right. We know that there's violence. We know that there's a lot going on behind the curtain, as you say. The testimony continues. There's a lot of testimony in this case. That a month before, the couple had actually stopped sharing a bed and Robert had moved to the sofa downstairs. And they'd only just recently started co-sleeping again.
But you know what comes out from that testimony and how you're building it up is I'm trying to picture the power dynamic and also the powerlessness of Carrie. She just doesn't seem to be able to get the help to change these circumstances. Would that be common in terms of the social arrangements of the time?
Most definitely, right? Robert is presented as a very controlling, very threatening man. And Carrie is in this situation of dependency, right? Even though they are not legally married, she still is economically dependent. And so is her mother on this household surviving together. Perhaps the expression is you've kind of made your bed and now you're lying in it to adjust the expression a little bit.
Yeah.
I think they feel stuck. I think the women feel like they cannot probably make it on their own. And they're hoping that this situation between the three of them in this shared household across 2 generations will at some point kind of turn a corner and he'll start to contribute in a more positive way.
And I mean, these are difficult things to be able to prove definitively or whatever. But the not sleeping, Carrie not sleeping with Robert, how unusual was it for those kinds of sleeping arrangements to exist at this period of time?
Yeah, it's actually not that uncommon, especially in younger marriages where there is no birth control, right? So the only birth control that's really respectable and accepted is abstinence. In this instance, because the couple is certainly not young, and she is probably past her years of actually being able to get pregnant, the idea of them probably sleeping in different beds, again, not uncommon. And it doesn't, in this case, of course, have anything to do with pregnancy. It's all just about the pattern of life and social behavior during this period. It's very uncommon for men and women to take separate bedrooms if they have the means to do so. In this case, he's sleeping on the sofa, which is much more like today's world of, I'm sending you to the sofa for the night because I'm angry with you. It's not so much a status piece because they don't have a separate bedroom. This is him being kicked to the curb a little bit and being punished because he's not been good in the relationship.
And you've raised the M word already in the podcast, in the episode about masculinity. Does the fact that Carrie isn't prepared to sleep with Robert, would that be interpreted by him as a challenge to his masculinity? He wasn't able to have sex with his partner. Would this have been seen as yet another assault, as he would have interpreted it, on what he could have expected from his relationship?
Yeah, I think challenge is actually a really good word there. I'm not a psychiatrist, but what I would say is we've developed certainly a pattern of abuse, a pattern of control, a pattern of dominance. And if she is the one saying, go sleep on the couch, then that shifts that pattern. If he is the one choosing to sleep on the couch, then that's a different story altogether, but we don't know.
And obviously, we've been building up a picture in relation to murder. But would it have been premeditated? Would Robert have reached a position where he thought, I am going to kill Carrie because she's been forcing me to sleep on the couch? Or is this manslaughter? Is this just, there's a spark on that particular night, something is said, something is done, and he loses control in that moment. Do we have any evidence from the trial about that?
Carrie's mother, Phoebe, testifies that she hears Robert going up and down the stairs 3 times during the night, but no one ever testifies that there is yelling and screaming and arguing that night. So we can take this pattern of this abusive relationship, aggressive masculinity. Of course, society is telling him that's how he's supposed to behave. This strong family unit where he is very much the dominant player. We see that with John as well in the brother-in-law. We also see a very male-dominated pattern of behavior there as well, and the way he prevents his wife, Julia, from stepping in, right? And every time that comes up, that Carrie wants to call the police, that Carrie tells Julia, I want to do something about this, John steps in and says, no, we're not going to get involved. So we have 2 very dominant male players here. I think it's probably likely that something just spilled over that night when this story comes out and starts to be discussed in the newspapers. The newspapers describe Robert as a stiff man with the appearance of an old soldier. Now, I've said that twice, but I want to say it again because that is really a term in this context in newspapers that is used often when describing someone who is a criminal or perhaps public drunkenness, someone who is kind of unkept, dirty, a drain on society. So while he is in court saying, I'm a veteran, I'm okay, this was just an accident, the women are saying, well, actually, no, he's not a good man, and there's this pattern of behavior. The army piece, I think, is actually really important in this particular case, because even though veterans from this period weren't necessarily venerated and beloved by the community as they were post-World War I and post-World War II. They are still seen as people who did contribute to their country and the defense of the country. And of course, we're in the period of the empire, and that's important. That sense of nationalism is very important across the country, right? It's a very patriarchal situation, patriarchal community and society. So even though there is a pattern of domestic violence, this is not a period in which domestic violence is really seen as such, not in the way we do today, right? This is still a period in which husbands really cannot rape women legally.
Yeah.
Right. So this is a very shaky area in terms of how women are treated inside the home. Well, as you know, David, on Was Justice Served, we cannot get to the verdict without your verdict first. So what would you have done if you had been a juror sitting on this case?
Look, sadly, this is a type of violence and that I see all too often in my work as a criminologist. And I would have seen this at best as manslaughter and more likely as murder. Remember, Carrie's mother is living downstairs. The fact that we don't hear an argument suggests to me that this isn't murder, it's not premeditated.
We've talked a lot about the habits of this relationship and this family grouping. There's clearly a line of abuse, but domestic disputes doesn't always mean murder. In this instance, is it premeditated?
Well, there is obviously a history between them, which is consistent with there being coercive, controlling behavior, what we would call domestic abuse. There's shouting. He's not an easy man to live with. We hear testimony about that. But in terms of, Robert going and buying a gun, in terms of Robert having a knife in the bedroom, this feels not premeditated. Therefore, it doesn't have the mens rea, the guilty mind that would be able to prove murder. This feels much more like manslaughter. This feels like 5 minutes of madness. This feels like a rage that gets prompted by something that happens in that bedroom on that night that Carrie ends up dead, which might simply have been, if we just think about it, that she doesn't want to have sex with Robert. My suspicion is this, that a jury is going to be impressed by the fact that they are dealing with an army veteran and that there will be credit given to him for his service to the country, which is somehow seen as excusing what might have taken place in the domestic bedroom.
So I think you're right. I think the jury gives him credit in this instance, even though he's disheveled and he's unkept and he's violent. There's also this kind of social sense of the man has a right to do what the man is going to do because it's his house. So I agree with you on the leaning towards manslaughter. I definitely think that he was guilty. I think he killed her, but I don't think the jury is going to come back with a straight murder conviction.
We're kind of on the same page on this.
We're a little bit on the same page, yeah. And it's unfortunate, right? Because again, this is a long-standing issue in society. Partners abuse each other. It's incredibly sad, but this is where the society was in that moment in time.
Well, and perhaps where society still is.
Yeah, for sure.
2 women a week are murdered in England and Wales by their partners or ex-partners. So what happens?
So, quite interestingly, the jury actually only takes 8 minutes to deliberate this case.
8 minutes.
8 minutes. Now, we know juries didn't take days and days like they do today. 3-4 hours would have definitely been seen as a long time, but 8 minutes does feel quite quick. They actually come back on a guilty charge of manslaughter.
Manslaughter, yeah. And what sentence then does Robert get for having committed manslaughter?
The judge sentenced him to 3 months of hard labor.
3 months?
3 months of hard labor.
That's it?
That's it.
Oh dear. And so then he comes out of jail, and one of the things that you and I have discussed before is, well, does he reinvent himself? Does he marry again? What does he do with his life once he comes out of jail?
It's really interesting, actually. His life is practically unchanged as a result of this event. He no longer has this woman that he's living with and her mother, but other than that, he just doesn't really do any time in prison. He goes on continuing as a laborer. Now, what happens in this period later along in the Edwardian period, David? What big event takes place?
Well, we're going to have World War I cropping up soon.
He re-enlists.
What age would he be by then, Jen?
He's 53 years old, about 53 years old when he re-enlists. So certainly not a young man, and he's definitely not going to be sent over to France or Flanders to fight in the trenches.
Does he have a distinguished career?
He rises to the rank of corporal in 1916, so he's not doing terrible for himself. He's moving up in the ranks. He's discharged in 1918 and given an army pension, which is also kind of a recognition of service spent and time well spent. He receives a Silver War badge. Not completely on the straight and narrow. He's reprimanded for drunkenness during the war and is involved in an assault and stealing case later in 1924. So he's a couple of incidences in there, but nothing that would have indicated to the military, to the army, that he wasn't deserving of recognition. He dies of heart failure in Chelmsford in 1935 at the age of 72.
So he lives another 29 years after Carrie is murdered. Obviously, it's a manslaughter charge, but effectively, she's killed by Robert. So, this is quite extraordinary, really.
It's almost 3 decades worth of life that he got that she didn't get. I think that that's particularly unfair, actually. And again, kind of another, we've talked about this so many times, David, that while we are asking, was justice served? Of course, for the victim, it never really truly is, right?
I wonder what Tom makes of all of that. I wonder what Tom thinks about his, because sometimes we only talk about perpetrators. Mm-hmm. And actually what we should be thinking more about is Carrie, who's robbed of those 3 decades because her life is taken. And it's so often the case, though, isn't it? Because, it's Findmypast, is justice served? But isn't it ironic that often the lives of people who are involved in crime survive over the decades, survive over the centuries? We know about their life because either they were the victim or they were the perpetrator.
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting dilemma for family historians, right? Like Tom, like myself. I also have a crime case in my family tree. It took a little while to grapple with that and to really understand the context of those events and how it has its repercussions on the modern generation, right? Today's generation. So if I were Tom, I would be looking at this as an essential piece of my family history and really thinking about the implications and kind of, when you throw the stone into the pond and you see the ripple effect, what is the ripple effect of being the descendant of the victim?
Well, thank you for sharing that story with me, Jen. And we'd like to thank Tom,
Absolutely,
in particular, for sharing the story that we've been discussing today. And you're going to ask that famous question that's become part and parcel of this podcast, Jen Baldwin, which is...
Was justice served?
The answer is no.
No. Unequivocally, no.
In the next episode, we're diving into a Scottish story, of course, my native land, and set in the Highlands, and we'll try and work out if there was a tragic accident or something much more sinister.
All the stories you've heard in this podcast were uncovered using Findmypast historical newspapers and records. If you're new to family history and you want to delve into your own past, start your free trial on Findmypast and get 15% off any monthly subscription for your first 6 months using the code JUSTICE. This offer is valid until the end of 2024.